Hello, and welcome to today's OWI Institute webinar, Cybersecurity, Trust and Safety, Enhancing Trust and Safety Through Supply Chain and Vendor Risk Management. I'm Katie Stevens, the Director of Education at OWI. The OWI Institute's webinar series is designed to bring you the latest research and analysis about identity, trust, and safety, presented by OWI's research team and leading industry experts. Upcoming topics include trust frameworks with Don Thibault from OIX and Annette Steenbergen with the Aruba Happy Flow project for the government of Aruba, as well as using biometric technologies to enhance trust and safety with Maxine Most of Acuity Market Intelligence. We'll get started in a minute or two, but before we do that, we have a couple of housekeeping items to take care of. First off, throughout the webinar, poll questions related to the content will appear on your screen. These are intended both to help us learn about our audience as well as to track continuing education participation. So when those appear, please take a few seconds to answer them and we'll post the results to share with you as well. If you've logged into the webinar with the email you registered with and you participate in those polls, then you'll receive a certificate of participation by email later this week that you can submit to your professional association for continuing education credit. If you have a technical issue at any point during the presentation, please use the on-screen chat button to chat with the panelists so we can attempt to help you. And if you have a content question during the presentation, please use the Q&A button at the top of your screen to send questions to our team. Our presenter will answer as many as he is able to during the Q&A period at the end of the presentation. All right, let's get started. Today we have Joe Stuntz, the Vice President of Cybersecurity at OWI. Joe's focus is building security into business decision-making, which includes consulting with organizational security programs and leadership, working with security and IT vendors, and advising financial firms that invest in the cybersecurity sector. Before joining OWI, Joe worked at the White House, where he served as the Office of Management and Budget Cyber Director of Program Performance, where he developed and managed government-wide cybersecurity programs and policies. Joe lives in the DC area with his family, and he hopes that this is finally the year for the Washington Wizards. To kick us off, we'll start with our first poll. So please take a look at the question on your screen and share your thoughts with us. With that, I'll turn it over to Joe. As soon as we have some results we can share with you. All right, and here are the results from our first poll, and I'll turn it over to Joe.
Sure. Can everybody hear me? Please raise your hand using the little raise your hand button. Perfect. So first of all, thank you, Katie, for kicking us off. Thank you all for coming today. So just to go over briefly the poll responses, the most popular choice this afternoon was I have no idea. On the brighter side, there 3 people answered yes to one or the other, which is good, which means that there are some organizations represented today that are a little more further down sort of the process that we're going to talk about. While we are going to cover this at a relatively high level to get through as much as we can, I am going to add mix in details for those that have already gotten started sort of on this process. So again, as Katie mentioned, you have the ability to submit questions. So please feel free to send in any questions that may arise throughout the webinar, and I'll address as many as I can before we wrap up. I also like to mention that while I may refer to a few specific companies by name, these are for illustrations. that does not constitute an endorsement of any particular product or service. If you have questions about particular products that I've used in my experience, that organizations that I've worked with have used, happy to do that offline or after this webinar. If you're curious about any details that I don't get to or would like to know more, I will provide my contact information at the end of this, and I'm happy to answer any questions or focus on any specific areas. So with that introduction, we're going to go to the next slide, which is what you'll learn. So we're going to go through this a little quickly so we can get to the good stuff. But I wanted to provide a little bit of context around why this topic is so important and why I wanted to cover it today. In my previous, as Katie mentioned, I recently joined from the White House Office of Management and Budget Cyber Team. And when I first started at the White House, the concerns of service providers for government agencies had really started getting more attention because of some breaches we will go through a little bit later. There was clearly a need for sort of a more standardized way to look at this in terms of requirements, contract clauses, and something like the concept of a program we called business due diligence. Through partnerships with agencies and experts in security, procurement, and IT, we developed a number of these standard contract clauses, worked with NIST, the official government standard setting body, on potential standards for cybersecurity for partners with the government. And their GSA ran a pilot business due diligence program. Now, timing is everything, and unfortunately, after a number of months of work, the OPM incident happened, which you all are likely familiar with. If not, 22 million background records, PII records were stolen, including background investigations information. So this took priority for all other sort of cyber related efforts, and this more vendor management, supply chain risk focused effort was moved to the back burner. So after working on the OPM breach for a number of months, it became clear that thinking in development, sort of putting the pieces together of a program and the implementation is really the easy part. It became much more difficult in terms of getting everyone to agree on the best way to implement this effort. For example, government works with a number of small businesses. There were a lot of discussions on how these requirements would potentially exclude small business. So to make sure we had feedback from all the appropriate stakeholders, we issued a draft policy for public comment. And I don't think any of my current new colleagues in industry thought anything we had was a good idea. It was very, in their opinion, and I think they were right on a lot of this, it was very difficult to determine the right data sources to assess the security of firms. Standards would never apply evenly to different types of businesses, especially around small businesses, and this would potentially take them out of the market. And there were many other challenges that were brought up in this public comment period, and so the program as a whole was never formalized. Pieces of this project were implemented, including a business due diligence program that some agencies are currently using. But this effort had left me with, not frustration, but with this is a really hard problem. And I've remembered that, and it's something that I've started working on here in my new role to work with clients to help understand sort of from top to bottom what this means. And I'm hoping to go through that and give you all a sense of what we're working on today. When I talk to organizations and this risk comes up, the mitigations and sort of the implementation layer are hard for many of the same reasons I found in my former government role. There are new regulations, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the regulations, but we are going to touch on them that address sort of the third-party risk idea. And this has been helpful for awareness. I still think, what are the right data sources? Different industries have different data sources. Who has access to those data sources? That's a challenge. How to make, and I will go through the challenges as you see in that third block there, current state challenges. But fortunately, a lot of the lessons learned in our attempts in government have translated over to some of the efforts that I've been involved with. So to help people either improve their management of the risk or sort of get started in this area, we're going to walk through 4 high-level areas. Now, first, how supply chain and vendor risk fits in with trust and safety. Second, why should anyone prioritize supply chain and vendor risk? We're going to touch on regulation and breach examples to highlight the risk that is involved. We're going to go through the current state challenges that I have seen in both my roles in government and my role here at OWI. And then finally, we're going to go through some best practices, what I've seen that's successful. And this is where I'd love feedback throughout, but I'd certainly love feedback on what organizations represented here have seen that were most successful for them in this area. So one thing I want to point out before we dive into the detail, there are a lot of terms around this. I will try and be consistent, but depending on which organization you're talking to, which vendor you're talking to. So you may hear supply chain, vendor risk, vendor management, third-party governance, third-party risk management, value chain security. There are some differences in this, especially when considering products versus services. For my purposes, I will try and keep them together, but we are focusing more on the service provider side today, although a lot of the mitigations are very, very similar. So as we move forward, I am going to try and leave about 10 minutes at the end for questions, hopefully answers, but certainly questions. And again, I will provide my contact information in case we don't get to something. So next up, how supply chain and vendor risk fit in with trust and safety. So trust and safety is a construct and an organization and a theory that we at OWI are really believers in and are working with a few clients on developing today. Trust and safety is really the lens in which we look at the challenges in the digital ecosystem, which include supply chain and vendor risk management, and especially challenges that include identity or security information. For the formal definition that's in our free white paper that's available on our website, we define trust and safety as a contextually dependent set of business values and practices that increase participation in and engagement with a digital ecosystem by reducing the risk of harm, fraud, or other criminal behavior toward an individual or organization's self or reputation. If harm is inflicted or fraud does occur, proper recourse mechanisms are in place to reestablish a strong sense of trust and safety. By establishing trust, a stakeholder may participate in an ecosystem. Maintaining a sense of safety ensures nothing goes wrong when participating in that ecosystem. So while that is a relatively long definition, I think it highlights a number of important things that I want to address right up front here today. This concept of trust and safety is directly relevant because of the organizational challenges that lead to trust and safety issues also lead to supply chain and vendor risk issues. At a high level, the definition you just heard, you may think, isn't that covered by the security team or the risk and compliance team or the fraud team or the identity management team, depending on your organization. And what we found in our research and in our work with clients is that there is no one team that is focused as broadly as we feel trust and safety sits. At a high level, that our research shows that responsibility for grading trust and safety falls normally between the teams of risk and compliance, identity management, and cybersecurity. While these organizations often rely on similar or even the same data, similar or even the same types of tools, they do not often work together well or share information quickly. There is a similar dynamic related to supply chain and vendor risk management issues, which we will go into detail on later. Another critical point I want to get across in bringing supply chain and vendor risk into the idea of trust and safety is the concept and sort of just the general current state of operating in a broader ecosystem. Establishing trust and safety is very important for engagements and relationships with customers, but it is also important for interactions with partners, stakeholders, others in industry, even your competition. Because of the proliferation of technology and business models around providing a service, any number of cloud services, software as a service, infrastructure as a service, et cetera, and the push for organizations to really focus on core competencies and outsource anything else, organizations are now more connected to other organizations more than they have ever been before. This connectivity has enabled gains in productivity and faster sharing of information, but it has also introduced more risk. A point that's come up in a number of my recent discussions has been that in the push for trust and safety, in addition to the publicity of large breaches that I'm sure we're all aware of, has driven security teams to actually get better in many cases. It may not seem like that due to the number of breaches we hear about, but the organizations that I've worked with and that I've seen, security teams, sort of the internal processes and procedures are getting much better. While this is a good thing, it has pushed adversaries to other areas where the boundary is lower. So we've defined trust and safety. I've covered the increased risk due to reliance on third parties, and this is now going to go into a little bit about why our adversaries are going. So because internal security programs are getting better, adversaries still have a goal to get the information that those security programs are protecting. There are many ways that they do this. You all are certainly familiar with phishing emails, and we could have many webinars on different sort of attack vectors and ways to defend against them. But I do want to highlight that in many cases, and we'll go through some of the breach examples, most adversaries look for the easiest way in. And as internal security programs get better, they go to the boundary or the edge, which in often cases is interconnectivity with other organizations. As I said, we will go through this further, but I want you to remember that as we talk about some of these examples, the reason why they looked at this particular vendor, because it was the easiest. And finally, tied in directly with that sort of looking at the boundary is there has been a disappearance of the traditional perimeter. Trends like cloud and mobile, which again are large topics that I'm not going to go into detail on today, have contributed to the disappearance of the traditional organizational and technological perimeter. Some of you all may be familiar with concepts like a zero trust model. Google has a program or a concept called Beyond Core that talks about this quite a bit. This means that you basically don't have a trusted internal network. You assume that all networks are compromised, and therefore everyone is sort of at the same playing field, whether you're an employee, an external vendor, a service provider, or even a potential adversary. And so they organize security in a different way versus relying on traditional perimeter boundaries. Because of this, previously, organizations had an idea of who was inside versus outside their traditional perimeters and could make some binary decisions about whether that individual or identity was trusted or untrusted. Now, I'm not making a comment if these binary decisions just based on, the perimeter was a good idea. That is, again, a separate webinar. By removing the perimeter for threats due to perimeter defense being proven to not be enough, it now really makes identity the new boundary. That is a nice saying, but it is really the truth that we're seeing in a lot of our engagements and research. And now, if you can't depend on someone with the right email address being an employee versus a service provider, that means that the identity attributes, things like biometrics, things like device authentication becomes much more important. In a zero trust model, one of the only ways to tell the difference between an employee, a partner, potential adversary is the identity and the attributes that gets presented. And this goes back to the idea of the trust and safety model, because since identity data is often in silos, it is contributing to the challenges with organizations being as successful and as productive as they can be if and when the perimeter disappears. So before we transition to talk about the regulations involved, because I know that's one of everyone's favorite topics, is to deep dive into regulations and selected breaches, I'd like to take a break for our next poll question. It is always nice when you're working on something like this and putting something like this on and the answers really demonstrate the point you're trying to hit. So I certainly appreciate the answers. And if you were being truthful, that's even better. But if you just wanted to help demonstrate my point, I also appreciate that. Similar to some of the first answers, the answer is highly dependent on the size and industry your organization exists in. I am actually pleasantly surprised at the number of people who said I have no idea. That is lower than I expected, so I am happy about that. So the next question that I want to talk about briefly is, why should anyone prioritize supply chain and vendor risk? In risk management, there's always a need to prioritize time and money. And in many organizations, supply chain and vendor risk rarely get the focus. Many security programs, risk and compliance teams, and identity management teams are not swimming through money. So it is hard to say, take resources away from what you have direct control over, which are your internal programs and procedures, and focus on this other area, which has all the complexity of your internal programs, but also involves procurement and legal agreements. Better alignment and shared resources between these internal teams will certainly help, as we discussed in the trust and safety section above. And we will go over some of the regulations that cover this and the breaches that involve partners to help demonstrate what can happen. Now, this, as a side note, this is not intended to scare organizations and anyone on this webinar into changing focus, just to provide evidence and data. In my almost 10 years in the cybersecurity and identity space, there has been a lot of efforts to scare people into action, and it hasn't worked yet. So I am not going to continue to try it, but just to provide information to hopefully drive people to make better data-driven decisions. So I want to go through a couple quick studies. A study done by PwC showed that 1/3 of breaches were tied to compromised third-party vendors. Now, this is in the retail space. I want to highlight that because I will go into a little bit of detail soon or shortly on the reason why I think retail is particularly difficult. But that just gives you an idea of the potential scope, depending on your industry, that you could be looking at in terms of the compromises that you are dealing with. Second, a study by Deloitte found that 53 1/3% of organizations had a high level of dependence, and that's a quote, on their extended enterprise. So to the point that I tried to make earlier, the risk, and I'm going to use a term, the risk surface, sorry, I'm a cyber person, is increasing because of that interconnectivity. So while previously you may have only had a couple vendors for very specific things, because today there is an effort to outsource everything that's not your core competency in many cases, you are more connected, organizations are more connected than ever. And this, while increasing productivity and efficiency, does really increase the risk. That seems like a basic point and an obvious one, but it's one that has gotten forgotten in a lot of the conversations of why should we focus on this now? Why are we doing this webinar now? The interconnection is only going to continue to increase, and we think we need to really focus on this now because of problems like we will go through right now. So I said I was going to get back into the retail study results. Many retailers, especially small retailers, outsource payment card systems. These payment card systems gather a lot of credit card information and are managed remotely, which makes them both valuable and potentially open to attack. Most of these payment card systems do not require physical access to the system itself. As I said, they are managed remotely. Payment card systems and the breaches and different mitigations are detailed enough to be an entirely separate webinar, but they are good examples of some of the challenges that even sort of non-traditional technology firms like retailers now have to deal with. Now, in many cases, I, as a consumer, am much more confident in the security and management of the devices by a firm that's core competency is payment card systems versus a retailer that may be running the store and whose core competency is inventory management, branding, design, etc. But because these devices are managed remotely, they have all the security issues related to things like the use of passwords and weak authentication and patching and maintenance. Security assumes that, and this is where I get into a little bit of the supply chain piece versus vendor risk. This also assumes that the machines themselves are built without weaknesses involved and can be patched quickly and effectively. These payment card systems are very valuable IoT devices managed remotely, and it is not surprised that they are often targeted, but represent one of the largest risks to a retailer today. So next, the target breach. This is another one that is fairly well known, so I will not go into detail. At a high level, this breach started with a compromise of an HVAC contractor's credentials. So the adversaries gained those credentials through a phishing attempt or a phishing campaign. They used those credentials to access a billing and contract management application that Target hosted for their vendors. Now, fortunately, and Target, set this up well. This particular application did not have access to a lot of other areas. This was sort of all they were supposed to be able to access. Unfortunately, this application was hosted on the same platform and on the same network as all their corporate information. And the adversaries eventually found a vulnerability in this billing application and contract management application, exploited it to move further into the system, getting into the Target corporate data, and eventually exfiltrating the credit card data. I do not highlight this breach to suggest that firms should do in-depth security assessments, continuous monitoring, and other mitigations for all vendors, including HVAC vendors, but to show how the increase in connectivity in business processes can lead to unintended consequences. Also, this demonstrates that mitigations that I recommend for internal programs like network segmentation, where you're limiting the capabilities of lateral movement, are often appropriate when dealing with vendors as well. The final example is through federal government vendors. The most recent example, and this is more of a supply chain product issue, is Kaspersky. I'm not going to go into much detail at all about this specific issue for any number of reasons. But in general, it highlights the risk that many types of security products, especially antivirus, has access to basically everything on your computer. And it is very important for both organizations and consumers to understand the access of antivirus tools and then what they do with that access. Now, as I mentioned before, the reason why I got into this field in my time in government is because of breaches of background investigation vendors. They were working for a number of firms, OPM, DHS, and others. There was a phishing campaign. You're going to notice a trend. There was a phishing campaign. Credentials were taken. These credentials were then used to log into the federal government systems that housed a lot of the data that was being used for these background checks. Therefore, the adversaries were then able to access federal government data without ever using a federal identity. Now, because these organizations were doing background checks and leveraging very sensitive data, this was not considered similar. I don't consider this similar to the Target breach. They should have had additional scrutiny just based on the data they have access to. And in our best practices, I'm going to go through a little bit about ranking and grouping your vendors into tiers or groups to make sure that you are putting the appropriate resources where you need to, while understanding that resources are limited. So now to everyone's favorite topic, regulation. I'm only going to touch on two today due to time constraints and most people's interest. Similar to scare tactics, often in the industry, there's threats of fines for compliance violations. In my experience, those threats have not led to a significantly more secure environment, but I do want to highlight these regulations as they are now much more directly addressing third-party risk with significant fines behind them and some targeted enforcement predicted. So the first is the New York Department of Financial Services, Section 500.03. This New York Department of Financial Services put out a large cybersecurity regulation. It's the first sort of comprehensive one at the state level. It has a lot of detail in there. If it's something that's interesting to you, there has been a lot of write-ups, a lot of implementation guidance, a lot of FAQs, because this is really the first state-level document directly related to ours, and not to go too off topic, directly related to supply chain and vendor risk. Section 511, 03.11, excuse me, third-party service provider security policy. I'm just going to quote a couple quick things from it. Each covered entity shall implement written policies and procedures designed to ensure the security of information systems and non-public information that are accessible to third-party service providers. Specifically, they require minimum cybersecurity practices, due diligence processes, periodic assessments, access controls, encryption, and notice of breach requirements. The New York Department of Financial Service requirements can be fairly specific, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But I do want, so I'm going to move on to one rule because there are some very similar things and some differences that I want to highlight. So the next is the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, Bulletin 2013-29, which includes enhancing risk management standards, expands the idea of what a third-party relationship is, especially introduces the idea of a critical activity, and introduces a new standard. A bank should adopt risk management processes commensurate with the level of risk and complexity of its third-party relationships. This document is still very relevant as the OCC released FAQs just this past June. Because I'm a former policy person, I have to point out a few of my favorite words. Commensurate with the risk, critical activities, complexity of relationships. This to me and the organizations that I work with mean that there is a lot of room for interpretation, and what actually gets implemented will vary wildly between the size and maturity of an organization. This is important because there is no checklist. Similar to GDPR, there is no way to really be compliant because in GDPR there's reasonable and appropriate, and here we're talking about commensurate. There are certainly positives to this, that they are not mandating the how to accomplish something, but it is harder from a compliance perspective to measure yourself against these types of words. So very, very quickly, so we can get to the best practices. The scope change is now including affiliates and joint ventures. Just again, sort of that disappearance of the traditional perimeter. If you're these are for financial organizations. Those financial organizations that are involved in joint ventures, the liability is still there. I want to give you the definition of critical activities. I warn you, it is not as clear as you might hope it to be. Significant bank functions, significant shared services, activities that could lead to significant risk, customer impact, investments, or major impact on bank operations. There are requirements for the board. The board is going to have much more liability. And the OCC considers effective third-party risk management to follow a particular life cycle: planning, due diligence and selection, contract negotiation, ongoing monitoring, termination, oversight and accountability, document and reporting, and independent reviews. We will simplify this life cycle somewhat for our purposes, but I do want to highlight the negotiation challenge depending on the leverage and buying power of your organization. So before we get to the current state and the best practices, I want to stop for the third poll question. Okay, so again, thank you for your honest answers. I appreciate those that said yes if their lawyers are watching this. I am unaware of the occupation of all the participants, and if any lawyers from your organization are listening, if they are, you are considering third-party and compliance activities, and that is good news. I think, again, this reflects sort of the general theme that we've seen throughout the poll questions. There is a mixed bag of implementation, awareness, and formality of the programs. This is very close to what I've seen in our research here at OWI and in my sort of personal anecdotal evidence from working with firms. So to keep moving, we're going to go through some current state challenges. You know, it is hard to separate supply chain and vendor risk management from some of the issues that we see in internal security programs. This is a good thing because some of the same things that programs are working on can also be effective in vendor risk and supply chain risk constructs. But if an organization hasn't done a good job in their secure internal program, it is highly unlikely they will do a good job in the vendor and supply chain risk area. So I'm going to throw a couple stats and then move on to some of the specifics. In a recent study, only 52% of respondents said they have security baselines or standards for third parties. I found this answer particularly fascinating because today, if an organization admitted that they have no internal security requirements or standards, that would likely be seen as a significant problem, and the CISO or CSO has a lot of explaining to do, in my experience. But when it's for third parties, that seems as something less important. This is particularly confusing when you think about the similar access to data and now liability based on some of these regulations for what people are what organizations are responsible for. So as mentioned in the introduction, the issue of ownership and responsibility for trust and safety topics remains an issue, as it is often covered in silos. Recent studies, this has shown this is not just in security or compliance, but is even more complex due to the procurement aspects of supply chain and vendor risk management. For example, the Ponemon Institute found that management of supply chain and vendor risk is housed in compliance 23% of the time, security, cybersecurity 17% of the time, legal 15% of the time, and procurement 15% of the time. So if you felt bad answering the poll questions, just know that all of those answers are seemingly common practices in industry. In our opinion and in our research, we've seen that none of those organizations typically have enough information on their own to solve and address the problem. And so, which is why we focus on helping organizations build that trust and safety mindset. So those organizations like fraud, compliance, cyber security, work together and share data to really to achieve trust and safety versus their individual siloed missions. Finally, there were similar results found by the Enterprise Strategy Group in a study where they asked organizations to name who manages IT vendor security audits. Now, they allowed multiple choices for this, so the percentages seem a little weird. But CIOs, 67% of the time, cybersecurity team, 51% of the time, risk management team, 37% of the time, compliance 30, executive management 30, specific supply chain cyber group 23%, and purchasing 18%. I give these statistics to highlight that while there is some awareness that this is a problem and it is being addressed, it is in no way being addressed in a consistent way. So the final challenge I wanted to focus on is the potential scale of a program. Depending on the size of your organization, you may have just a few vendors, but you also might have hundreds or even thousands. Why not all these vendors will require the same level of attention, as Target showed, it's not always easy to tell where the risk is. Finally, the scale point. As I've talked about throughout, the increase of connections means that there are more service providers involved in most organizations, and as more devices become connected, they also become part of the risk. Whether these are managed by third parties, like a payment card system, or a simple device like a webcam that's now connected to the network and must be maintained and patched, the risk surface is rapidly increasing, so the scale of this sort of external program must also increase. Finally, at this scale and scope, the scale is very difficult because blanket security policies and standard contract language will likely not be applicable across all the different types of vendors involved. So the program must work to tailor these as appropriate for the particular vendor relationship, but also have to manage them against these different requirements by vendor. The second point I'll make on the challenges is assessments. There are different types of assessments, and I'll go into some of the best practices around these. But for example, point in time or continuous. The two regulations above describe periodic assessments and ongoing monitoring. I don't want to, the point of this is not to say that one of these is better than the others. Both of these can be appropriate depending on the vendor, sensitivity of data, resources as continuous monitoring, and resources as continuous monitoring, and the more frequent of assessments require more resources, including specialized tools and often legal agreements from the partner organizations. Depending on the industry and type of data involved, there may be a single point in time or annual assessment that's good enough. These decisions need to be made after a risk assessment and considered regularly to determine if still appropriate. We will go into this in further detail in the best practices. Like other aspects of supply chain and vendor risk management, like organizational ownership, the assessments of security in general can be challenging. And this is made even harder by getting access to timely data and information to do these assessments of vendors. Because different types and maturity level of vendors, it may be difficult to maintain consistency across the assessments, which therefore makes it difficult to compare risk and determine where to put the most resources. Finally, procurement decisions, and this is where industry has a different challenge than government. Procurement decisions can often move quickly, and there are challenges in getting these access to data and getting the assessments done quickly. And so there are certain cases where this assessment could delay procurement. Finally, depending on the type of assessment and vendor, some of the data may be self-assessed and or self-asserted. While you should be able to trust the data coming from an organization you are giving access and money to, at least I hope so, unfortunately this is not always true. It is not necessarily that they are outright lying, but discussed a moment ago, assessments are hard and things can change quickly if you're doing getting a point-in-time picture. Without verifying the information, your organization is relying on them to do it right. So before I move into best practices, we're going to do another poll question. Interesting. So I think that the results here are a fair number of people responded that their use of third parties is increasing. Many people also said I don't know, which depending on where you sit in the organization is fine. I wanted to ask this question because we hear a lot about, and I've already mentioned it a number of times, about the increased risk because of interconnectivity. And there are many ways to go about resolving this, whether it's through vendor risk assessments and things like that, or are other firms, particularly ones with high security needs, insourcing more. This is something I've talked about with members of the defense industrial base and who often have large supply chains, but is an area where I'm interested and will continue to do research in, as I think that there may be a little bit of reversal towards reducing that connection if that connection can't be made securely. So the last large section that we're going to cover today are really the best practices. As you might have gathered from the rest of this presentation, this is a challenging issue, but there are things that can be done to start to address the risk. Some of the best practices we are discussed are long-term organizational changes in the vein of really reorganizing around trust and safety. These will not just help supply chain or vendor risk management, but often help larger challenges, general cybersecurity and identity management, for example. We will also include sort of programmatic implementation steps that can help in the short term as agencies or as organizations try and improve today. In our research and work, we believe that these silos in many organizations are a problem that must be solved in order to appropriately address cybersecurity, identity, and supply chain and vendor risk. At a high level, by enhancing trust and safety and including supply chain and vendor risk in this combined team, organizations can address the risk, gain compliance as a side benefit and oftentimes for implementing best practices, and better leverage identity as the new perimeter, and maybe even save resources by sharing tools. While these organizational changes that I talked about previously may be good and helpful in the long term, the problem still needs to be solved. At the implementation level, the good news is, as I said before, many of the same principles that apply to internal security policies and programs can extend easily. It is all risk management at the end of the day, so processes should look very similar. The bad news is that many of the basics that should be done internally, like knowing where your data is and who has access to it, has not been addressed yet in organizations and can be even harder in cloud environments, as demonstrated by the many recent open Amazon S3 buckets that researchers are finding with lots of valuable or even classified information sitting out in the open. The first step in any effort is to identify all the vendors in your space and the access rights they have. Depending on the size and complexity of your organization, this may be very easy or this may be very difficult. Despite this seeming like an obvious thing to do, I encourage programs to make sure this is done well before trying to address the risk. Resources are not unlimited, and there's always going to be a prioritization effort. But if you do not do a good job on the identification step, your prioritization will be off, and at best, resources may be wasted, and at worst, you could miss something that leads to the problem. To do a good job of this assessment, organizations must understand what data they currently have, where it is stored, and who has access to it. Now, ideally, this is already done as part of internal program efforts to increase trust and safety and protect data in a risk-informed way. If there is a lack of this inventory and understanding, then perhaps an awareness and highlighting the third-party risk will incentivize better internal understanding of what you have and where it is. Once you have an understanding of your partners and what they have access to, the next step is to group vendors into rough risk groups. Coming from the federal government, we like the basic, low, moderate, and high. Different organizations have done it different ways that I've seen. Some use 5 tiers, some use 3, high, medium, low. In a perfect world, in addition to the Wizards winning the NBA championship and everyone behaving in a secure way, every vendor would be continuously monitored and your organization would have the staff to review all that data and make quick decisions. But we do not live in this world, and so it is better so you must prioritize the use of your resources by focusing on the tier or group with the highest level of risk. In doing this ranking and grouping, I encourage organizations to consider what would happen if a breach occurred to you. I think there are some times where risk is considered more of a general thing versus company-specific risks. While an organization might be in the news, if it does not directly impact your operations because you're only using them for something small, or your relationship is ending, whatever the case may be, try and focus it on the specific risk to your organizations, not who would get the most publicity, who would get the most congressional letters, things like that. The next step is really to focus those available resources on the highest risk group of partners to understand their security posture and determine if they're appropriate for use as a partner in your organization. In most cases, this involves a point-in-time assessment, but there are a number of tools and service providers that provide a score or grade of an organization's cybersecurity. Organizations like BitSite, Security Scorecard, CyberGRX, and others are involved in this space. I do not mean to leave anyone out. I did not mean to leave anyone out, don't mean to leave anyone out on purpose. Those are just the 3 that I'm most aware of, and can be used to supplement or replace those security assessments. What these organizations and similar organizations do is they provide a score of the organizations before or during your contract period with them. If you use one of these companies and their scores, I encourage you to understand how they arrive at those particular ratings or scores. In my experience, much of the formula can be explained and makes a lot of sense, but it has always included a proprietary variable. This proprietary variable is something that I encourage you to understand and try and get as much information as you can, because while these tools are certainly better than a point-in-time assessment or self-asserted checklist from the partner and vendor, it is your organization's liability and your organization's risk, and you must be comfortable with defending the decisions you made that come from the scores that these service providers give you. Finally, for some organizations and the most valuable partners, it may be appropriate to put in place continuous monitoring. When you think about continuous monitoring, consider whether it's better to monitor the data, assets, processes, security controls, or something else, as monitoring takes a lot of resources, both in the setup and maintenance of the monitoring, but also of the review. It is not helpful to generate a lot of information if there are not people reviewing those logs and alerts. When doing continuous monitoring of a third party, similar to internal monitoring, procedures and agreements are needed around key performance indicators, reporting mechanisms, tracking of issues, and remediation processes. These should be as similar as possible to internal processes for ease on the workforce, but oftentimes must be tailored to reflect the needs and capabilities of the partner organization. So finally, the last piece I'll touch on very briefly, as we are almost out of time. The fun does not stop here. There is now organizations need to consider about fourth-party risk. At a high level, this means that you need to work with your third parties to ensure that their partners are also worth trusting. Because of the interconnectedness, a breach somewhere can have an impact on your business partners and then an impact on you. In contracts, one way to address this is in contracts. where you can add language where the third party has to notify you if they outsource capabilities to another group, that would be a fourth party, that are related to the service delivery for you. This is another massive part of the scale challenge, but is becoming more of an issue with the interconnectedness. So now we're going to move to the final poll question before I do a very quick wrap up. Okay. So the biggest answer was learn more about this issue. Either I did a really good job making you more curious, or I did a really bad job because I didn't actually inform you all of anything. I'm going to assume it's the first. So finally, it wouldn't be a webinar in 2017 if I didn't mention or even yell the word blockchain at least once. I have waited until the end because it is a technology that, while it may end up being helpful, there are organizational and procedural issues that must be addressed before any one technology, including blockchain, could be part of the solution. We did a full research report related to blockchain around identity, so I will not go into too much detail on the technology, but my evaluation is that blockchain could be a useful tool for establishing trust in products by tracking where they have been and who has worked on them. Broader uses around blockchain for identity would also apply to service providers, and I hope that blockchain solutions help address these issues going forward. But it is by no means a silver bullet. Blockchain itself has a trust problem. Who can we rely on to put quality information on the chain? How can we redress mistakes once they take place? Decentralized immutability is great until you need a trusted authority to actually put accurate information on the chain and fix things that are wrong. There's somewhat of a garbage in, garbage out problem. I don't want to say that all of the blockchain hype is wrong, and I do think that more thought and development is needed to best apply it to these difficult use cases. With that, I'm going to wrap up the formal part of our presentation, and I'd be happy to take a couple of your questions. Okay, so we have one question. Thank you, Don. I'll read it. Are insurance companies looking beyond risk associated with breaches to other risks, data aggregators, controllers, IDPs, RPs? How might continuous monitoring impact corporate insurance rates? Fourth-party risk seems hard to manage. So fourth-party risk is certainly hard to manage. Some of the tools I've mentioned and other vendors are looking at this as a way to provide sort of I do not represent them. They didn't sponsor this webinar. It's sort of a stock market approach. Like you can look at any number of companies and get a risk score, whether you're in a contract relationship with them or not. The challenges around where's that data and where's that score come from certainly still apply there, and I think are magnified. I think the second question, part of that question around how might continuous monitoring impact corporate insurance rates, is a great one, and is one that we're seeing a lot of movement on in the insurance industry. And I don't mean to insult the insurance industry, but they move deliberately. And so I don't expect this to happen overnight. But that continuous monitoring ability is one that some of the vendors that I've worked with before even highlight to price better insurance premium, to set better prices for insurance premiums. We provide sort of the detailed information that the insurance company wants. So that is a product suite that they are offering. It is something that a couple insurance providers I talk to are interested in. But again, when the scores include a proprietary variable, that has sometimes been a challenge, that if we're going to accept your score, we have to be able to explain it, especially if we're going to write policies against it, and that proprietary variable can be a real hindrance there. And then to answer your first question, I will have to defer to what insurance companies are looking at. Informally, I know that they are, especially around data aggregators with some of the recent Equifax breach and related conversations around that. But I will not speak for them on how they're looking at that particular subject. So that is the only current question. With that, as I promised, I will provide, that's all the time we have unless there are any more questions in the last 3 minutes. I would like to thank you all for attending today, and I hope this has been a useful overview of a fairly complex topic. As I said, there's a lot of details that I'm happy to go into if it's of interest to anyone. Please feel free to reach out to me directly for anything we didn't have time today or anything you want to dive further. My email is Stuntz, S-T-U-N-T-Z, at oneworldidentity.com. And I'd be happy to answer questions, and I'd also love to hear how your organization is looking at these challenges and maybe best practices that you all have found. So thanks again, and with that, I'll hand it back over to Katie.
Thank you so much, Joe, and thanks to all of our participants today. Our next webinar will be next Tuesday. We will take a look at trust frameworks with Don Tebow, who joined us here for this webinar today, as well as Annette Steenbergen with the Aruba Happy Flow project. You can register for that on our website. And lastly, before you go...
Oh, Katie, I'm going to jump in to answer the question.
Okay.
We got one more, sorry. Is there enough investment and development in understanding cybersecurity-related damages expenses by cyber-related insurance companies? So this is a very complex issue and topic that I will try and answer as shortly as I can. There is a lot of investment. The problem is where the data comes from. So every time a company reports a breach, you know, the Verizon data breach investigations report is one of the biggest data sets that I know of. There is a government working group led by DHS with a great acronym CDAWG, trying to put together a data set that insurance companies can price based on. But it is very difficult because that sort of past performance and historical data is not there that's openly available. As I said, Verizon's done a good job of bringing a lot of companies together, and DHS is trying to do something similar. But insurance companies are absolutely looking to, are investing and trying to develop these pricing because they need to know how to price their premiums so they don't lose on it. Sorry, Katie.
No worries. To wrap it up, just let you know that registration is also available for our No Identity Conference next March in Washington, D.C. And there, if you'd like to hear more about all the issues Joe discussed from a wide variety of industry perspectives, please plan to join us. Thanks to all of you and have a wonderful day.